Today, me and Boyka, we're going to be talking about caffeine content in tea, because very often we get these questions: which teas are more caffeinated and which teas are less caffeinated, which types of tea? Because many people are under impression that, for example, white tea is the least caffeinated type of tea, or Pu-erh tea is the most caffeinated type of tea. And this is what we're going to discuss, because we're hearing all these questions over and over again. So let's start this conversation with, that's the first question: which type of tea, Boyka, is the most caffeinated or the least caffeinated?
Hi, Misha. I'm glad to be part of this conversation and this hot topic in the world of tea. Indeed, this is a question that is being asked quite frequently. And it seems that there is no short answer to it. So it is not as simple as naming one or another tea type as the most or least caffeinated. So in order to understand, to have a better understanding on what makes a tea caffeinated, maybe we should start with a brief introduction to what caffeine represents at first.
Let's maybe first start with talking what are the main elements that tea consists of, like caffeine, L-theanine, like what are the main elements?
Yeah, exactly. So basically, caffeine is one of the main compounds in tea, together with the tea polyphenols and the amino acids. Caffeine forms the third important component of the tea leaves' inner substances. So it is largely defining for the taste and the quality of tea. So caffeine and tea polyphenols are the two main components that are responsible and form largely the bitterness in tea. However, there is a difference here too, because the bitterness caused by the polyphenols is different than the bitterness caused by caffeine. Namely, the tea polyphenols have a bitter and astringent taste. However, this kind of bitterness and this astringency is closely related to what we refer to as the tea sweet aftertaste, or hui gan, as it is called in Chinese. So this is, in short, the feeling that starts initially as a strong bitter taste in the mouth, and then quickly transforms into a sweet aftertaste. So this kind of transformation is due exactly to the polyphenol content in the tea leaves. And when there is a high polyphenol content, we can experience strong and intensive bitterness at first that will afterwards quickly transform into a sweetness. However, the bitterness caused by caffeine is a different kind of bitterness into that it doesn't transform, it's definitive. So it starts as a bitterness and it ends as a bitterness. This is also a way to distinguish whether a tea is richer in tea polyphenols or in caffeine. So this is from, so to say, a chemical point of view. Let's add also another important function of caffeine as a stimulant for the human body. So caffeine this is something that tea largely is enjoyed for, as well as coffee and other stimulant drinks that contain caffeine. It is because of the action of caffeine that stimulates the nervous system, among others, that increases the heart rate and promotes the action of the lungs and the bronchi. So it enhances our breathing.
And I
So
think it's important to mention that all teas, any teas, they contain some level of caffeine, because all teas, they come from the plant called Camelia sinensis, and this plant by default contain caffeine. Some varietals, they may contain a little bit more, some a little bit less, but all of them contain caffeine, and the only teas that are caffeine free are not technically teas, they are herbal teas, the herbs that we call tisanes.
indeed, yes. Normally, in the normal case, all tea, and I'm speaking strictly about tea, not tisanes, not herbal teas, but all tea is considered caffeinated as it comes from the Camellia sinensis or some varieties of the Camellia sinensis. Okay, so technically, just to be really precise, there seem to exist the so-called non-caffeinated teas. Well, these seem to be a certain varieties of the Camellia sinensis tree that are found in some areas in China, probably in other countries too. But as far as my experience is concerned, I have heard about those, and I have spoken about those that are met in China. In Guangdong, for example, there exists a specific tea tree variety that is a Camellia sinensis tea tree variety. However, the tea that comes from this tree is virtually contains no caffeine. So instead of caffeine, it contains another kind of alkaloid, which is a type of substance that caffeine is actually. So instead of caffeine, this kind of tea contains theobromine, which is an alkaloid found normally in cocoa. So this is probably one of the reasons that the locals call it ke cha, which would literally translate like cocoa tea. So I have also heard that there, although I have never experienced it myself, I have never drank this kind of tea myself, a specific tea variety also in Yunnan, again, strictly speaking about tea here. I'm not speaking about tisanes, no herbal teas, just tea, regular tea. However, some tea tree variety in Yunnan is also supposed to produce a non-caffeinated tea. But these are exceptions, these are exceptions to the rule. And by rule, as you said, all tea coming from the Camellia sinensis tea tree is considered caffeinated, so containing caffeine. After after precising about the chemical role of caffeine and its role in our body, what it does to our body, there is also another question that pops up frequently about whether caffeine in tea and caffeine in coffee are one and the same thing. So the short answer is yes. So technically, they are the same molecule, so they're the same substance. It's just that caffeine was first discovered in coffee, like probably 2 centuries ago. And then a couple of years later, another research detected the presence of a similar ingredient in tea. And initially it was named theine in order to distinguish the caffeine found in tea from caffeine found in coffee. However, well, it took the research team some time before they actually discover that it is actually one and the same thing, one and the same substance. And so from them on, the common term caffeine was adopted for the substance both in tea and in coffee. It is important not to confuse theine with theanine, which is something completely different, and we will discuss this in details a bit later. So as we mentioned, thein is just another name for caffeine, which is caffeine found in tea, and it is not really in use anymore. So we normally refer to caffeine as caffeine, regardless of whether it is found in tea or in coffee. However, when we're speaking about theanine, it is an important amino acid, so another kind of chemical substance found in tea leaves. And it has really nothing to do with caffeine, both in terms of origin and in terms of effect on the human body. So we will return a bit later on the amino acids as the third big group of substances in tea, and we will discuss what it does to the human body, its effect on the human body.
What contains more coffee? Because there is a confusion about it, whether some people say that coffee is, of course, more caffeinated, and some people say that, even though it doesn't seem like it, but in fact, tea is more caffeinated than coffee. So let's debug this myth as well.
Yeah, indeed. So the question on which one contains more caffeine, tea or coffee? Well, yes. Again, it is there is no short and simple answer on this question because of several factors that influence the caffeine content, the overall caffeine content in tea versus coffee. So first of all, let's talk about the facts. So comparing the amount of caffeine found in tea to the one found in coffee. So usually the amount of caffeine in tea accounts for 2.5 to, let's say, 3.5% from the overall substances amount in tea leaves. So let's say it's an average of 3% accounts to caffeine in tea leaves. For coffee, this percentage is somewhere between 1 and 1.7%. So let's say an average of 1.5%. However, the usual individual dosage that we use for brewing a tea within one tea session tends to be less than the amount of coffee we use for one, let's say, coffee session. So if, say, we use somewhere between 3 to 4 grams of tea for the same drinking session, we would use normally twice or even more of that amount in coffee. So we actually compare brewing 4 grams of tea, let's say we use the same amount of water, let's say like a cup of 150 milliliters. So for the same cup of 150 milliliters of water, we would use 4 grams of tea versus, let's say, 8 and more grams of coffee. So by the above calculation, let's say we take like an average of 3% of caffeine content for tea leaves. Well, for like 4 or 5 grams of tea, it will amount to somewhere between like 125, 130 milliliters. While let's say for 8 and more grams of coffee, it will be probably above 140 milliliters. Sorry, milligrams of caffeine. So it seems that although caffeine content in tea leaves as an absolute number, as an absolute value is higher, in terms of personal intake compared by the dosage of what we use of tea leaves versus coffee, tea will eventually provide us with less caffeine than coffee. So we're talking here again about the same 150 milliliters cup that we will use to brew our tea versus our coffee. So again, although technically caffeine as a percentage is higher in tea, in terms of personal intake, whether tea or coffee will supply us with more caffeine largely depends to our drinking habits and our individual dosage of tea leaves versus coffee that we use.
What affects the caffeine levels in certain teas? You know, how do you determine which teas are more caffeinated than others? Or is there even a way to determine before tasting them? Because as you already said, you know, once you taste the tea and you feel this bitterness, you can kind of figure out with a certain amount of experience whether it comes from caffeine or it comes from other polyphenols. But without tasting the teas, is there a way to determine which teas are more caffeinated than other teas?
Yes, of course. Although, as we mentioned earlier, as we started this conversation, there is no short or simple answer as to which tea type is most or least caffeinated compared to other tea types. There are other factors that we may well use in order to determine the approximate level of how caffeinated actually our tea is. So by the method of exclusion first, it is not, we're not talking here about some of the tea types. So if, for example, like we harvest like a specific tea bush, and then we take like one part of the harvest and dedicate it for producing, say, white tea, and then we take another part of the harvest dedicated to producing green tea, and we produce, say, yellow tea with the third part of the harvest. The caffeine amount in those three finished teas will be roughly the same, provided we use the same material.
So basically, can we say, can we say that processing does have an effect on caffeine levels, or processing is a secondary factor in caffeine?
Well, there has been an interesting study that has been published and in China in 2020, which states that caffeine content in tea leaves doesn't change in the -18 Celsius to +60 Celsius temperature variations. So this is a quite large extension, and well, the usual storage and the usual processing that tea from the 60 types undergo usually happens within those ranges. Okay, so I'm putting aside the Shaxing phase, of course, because it's related to higher temperatures, but as normally almost all tea types undergo it, so it's more or less the same for them. But that would mean that the usual storage and the usual processing of the tea leaves will not really affect considerably the caffeine content in the tea leaves. Probably there is one exception to this, but we will mention it a bit later. So from a production and processing point of view, it seems that the 6 tea types as we know them in terms of processing are not a factor when we define the overall level of caffeine that is found in finished tea. So what are then the factors, like the real factors that define the caffeine in tea? There is a number of factors, and we will start with probably the most obvious one, which is the tea tree variety. So as we have mentioned earlier, all tea coming from the Camelia sinensis and its subvariations is caffeinated tea. However, there is, although it may be a slight, but there is a difference in the caffeine amount which is found in the different varieties of the Camelia sinensis tree. Research is a bit contradictory here with some research and the general attitude being towards Camelia sinensis variation Assamica being the most caffeinated tea tree variety. There is another research on this, however, which states that the original Camelia sinensis variation Sinensis is the most caffeinated variety, and by this research, it claims that its caffeine content accounts to almost 3% of the dry leaves weight. And again, according to this same research, the Yunnan large leaf variety, like Assamica, is next with around 2.5% of the dry leaves weight. Again, this is one research. There are other researchers that claim the opposite, that the Assamica variation is more caffeinated than the original Sinensis variation. Me, for the most part, I'm not a botanist. I wouldn't dare, say which one is true or which is not.
Gotta love this ambiguity.
Yeah. So there is a room for everyone.
Yes.
Here to defend their point of view. However, what we know from this research, be it contradictory, is that the tea tree varieties differ in terms of caffeine content. So, by the way, I will just open a parenthesis because apparently there is a research that claims that Camellia sinensis variation Sinensis, or the original tea tree, is the more caffeinated one, and this it seems to contradict the general idea that people have, because it seems like the general idea points towards the Yunnan large leaf tea tree variety being more caffeinated than the original Sinensis strain. This idea probably stems from this intensely bitter taste and kind of a strong tea that some Yunnan varieties possess. So as we mentioned in the beginning of our conversation, the intensive bitterness might be a sign of a high polyphenolic content in tea leaves, not necessarily because of caffeine. And this is largely it can be identified by the kind of bitterness that we experience. Again, when we are talking about a strong bitterness in the beginning, which quickly transforms into a sweet aftertaste, into a sweet returning taste, this refers more to a high polyphenolic content rather than caffeine. However, because people experience this strong bitterness first, and they associate it right away with caffeine. So this also might be in the root of this idea that the Yunnan large leaf tea tree variety is more caffeinated than other trees. However, it's not just the tea tree variety that defines the caffeine content. There are other factors, and there are also natural factors in terms of the natural environment that also define the caffeine content. So among those would be things like the soil, the amount of sunshine the tea tree receives, the levels of moisture, the altitude, and even things like the amount of shade that the tea tree receives. Excessive sunshine actually because it stimulates the growth, and at the same time, excessive sunshine and excessively hot weather is usually connected to insufficient moisture. And sufficient moisture is also one of the key elements needed for the formation of the amino acids in tea leaves. So this is also another reason for an existing theory comparing the different harvests of tea during different seasons. So spring, summer, autumn, and winter tea, wherever it exists. But let's say comparing spring to summer tea, so the season as a factor in caffeine content here. There are again two contradicting theories on this. One says that the spring tea is usually highest in caffeine as the growth rate is most intensive in spring, and apparently the plant will try to stack up the highest possible amount of nutrients and inner substances as a whole. And caffeine, being representing one of the important inner substances, will also be stacked in higher quantities. The contradicting theory, however, claims that the summer tea, due to the excessive hot weather, the excessive sunshine, and the insufficient moisture, makes for the tea tree to stack up in polyphenols and in caffeine simply because there aren't enough factors which will assist the stacking up of amino acids, so the other compound, which usually requires more moisture, which is absent in the summer. So yes, season also can be a factor in caffeine, in defining the caffeine content.
So generally speaking, we can assume that spring harvest and summer harvest are more caffeinated, usually, generally speaking, than fall harvest and winter harvest, where the weather allows for the winter harvest.
Indeed, yes. So generally, the seasons that are, with more sunshine, more warmth, are considered to give more caffeinated tea. So speaking about the natural factors, we mentioned about the soil as well, and there is the question of fertilization. So because fertilization artificially enhances the plant's development, it promotes the plant development. And part of the plant development is the accumulation of inner substances in the leaves. So, because we're speaking about the tea plant here. So fertilized tea is usually known to contain higher amounts of caffeine than the naturally grown ones. Altitude also can be a factor in defining the caffeine content. So when we talk about the so-called high altitude tea, usually in the high altitudes, the tea trees, as all other plants, grow at a slower pace. So they grow slower than their counterparts in the lowlands. However, because they have a strong root system, it's also a matter of survival, which can penetrate deeper into the lower layers of the soil. So it will absorb, it will suck up additional minerals and nutrients, like it will provide rich amount of nutrients to the plant itself. And this is why this kind of tea is it's more refreshing, and it's sweeter. It has a sweet taste, and it has also a very rich aroma without necessarily being excessive in caffeine, because the three groups of chemical substances are more harmoniously divided within the tea leaf. So on the contrary, the tea in the lowlands grows faster because it's hotter there. The temperatures are higher. There is more sunshine usually. So what it can make up in amino acids, in aromatic substances, it stacks up in tea polyphenols and caffeine. So usually this tea will have like a strong and pungent even taste and it will definitely have higher levels of bitterness and astringency compared to the high altitude one. So regarding the natural factors, more or less natural or artificial when we're speaking about fertilization, there are also other factors that are depending on the tea plant itself, like, for example, which part of the tea plant we are using for our tea. because different parts of the tea plant will contain different amounts of caffeine too. So there is this, common idea that people believe that like the tea made from the most tender part of the tea leaves, say the bud only kind of tea, being so delicate and tender, it is somehow seen as being very gentle and not being caffeinated enough, or not being caffeinated at all. So as we precise, there is no, of course, with one or two exceptions, all tea is caffeinated, but all the more is actually the buds only tea. It is exactly for the same reason that we mentioned. So when the plant grows actively, when it's in an active growing phase, it will send out the largest amount of nutrients to its most actively growing parts. So as the buds are the parts of the plant that make it grow, so they're most actively, developing parts of the plant, they will naturally get the highest amounts of all inner substances and of all inner nutrients, and that includes caffeine. So bud-only teas are not only caffeinated, they are usually more caffeinated than teas produced with other parts of the tea plant.
So we can say,
yeah.
judging from that, like we know that many green teas, they made of very young, tender leaves. So we can assume that, there is more caffeine in those tender leaves. At the same time, green teas usually are not harvested at high altitudes as oolongs. So, there are these different factors coming into play, making it complicated to figure out.
Sure. Indeed, it is so. But yes, green teas, unlike what it seems lots of people think, are caffeinated. And because green teas are often, the higher quality green teas are often bud only green teas. So they are not just caffeinated, they sometimes can be even more caffeinated than other kinds of teas, which might be a good thing, by the way, because it is a great replacement for your usual dose of coffee.
So what about oolong teas, for example, that grow at high altitudes, and high mountain teas are usually oolong teas, but they are made of more mature leaves, larger leaves. But also, that I heard that stems right next to the leaf, where the leaf ends, this is also the part that contains lots of caffeine. And oolong teas, they usually have, like a little bit of stems, because this is what gives it the texture and the bite. So have you heard about that?
Right, that's interesting. Well, oolong indeed is a very interesting tea, and all the more the high altitude one that you mentioned. So regarding the stems, actually, I have heard, and the research that I have gone through actually claims that the stems are very rich in polysaccharides, which in turn makes the tea sweeter. And it gives this almost chewy feeling. It gives a very strong and rich mouthful. It gives really like a rich and plump body to the tea. So regarding oolong tea, yes, indeed, it uses more mature leaves along with buds and 1 to 2 leaves. It is common to add also more mature and more grown tea, more grown leaves to the oolong tea. Plus, as we said, the really high quality, good, high altitude grown oolong will, just like we said, it's not that it lacks caffeine. It's not that it has less caffeine. It's just that the inner substances are more in harmony between each other. So it is not the case of, let's say, like lowland summer tea, for example, which almost lacks amino acids. So it almost lacks this sweet note in the taste that makes it so desirable. And it lacks smoothness for this case. But it's too astringent and too bitter on the other part. In a high altitude tea, you will have enough of the amino acids that will contribute to this freshness, and sweetness, but you will also have enough of the caffeine and the polyphenols, which will provide this smoothness and which will give the tea its character. So it is, we would say, more harmonious kind of tea. Of course, it will have its caffeine, but it will also not lack other substances as well.
So we spoke about caffeine being resistant to heat, that it can withstand different temperatures. But you said that the higher level is like around 60 degrees Celsius, right?
Yes.
But then most teas go through this shaching state where we pan fry or steam those teas. But what about white teas that don't go through shaching, so they're not subjected to these higher temperatures? Does it mean that they retain more caffeine, they're able to retain more caffeine intact?
Well, to be honest, I don't really have an answer to that question. It seems that some white tea types are considered less caffeinated, actually, than others. While it might be partially due to the processing or the absence of some processing steps that are present in other teas, as you mentioned, like the shaching phase. I don't feel qualified enough to answer that.
Because we know that some white teas, like for example, Silver Needle by Hao Yinzhen, they comprise solely from buds. So these
Yes.
are the young leaves, that usually contain a lot of caffeine, and they don't go through, they're not subjected to this higher temperatures, and so on and so forth. So you would assume that they contain more caffeine. And speaking from personal experience, I know that particular tea, for me, for example, very often it gives me this tea high, the chazu. So, yeah. So from my personal experience, that's one of the actually more caffeinated teas, or at least I'm more sensitive to this one in particular. But then, of course, there are different types of white tea, like show made, or that doesn't have this young leaves, but also usually very often made of leaves from older trees, and stuff like that. So
indeed, yeah. Well, it's interesting what you say about white tea, because as I mentioned, it's generally believed to be less caffeinated than other tea types. On one hand, this might be due to some local tea tree varieties which are commonly seen as less caffeinated at first place. So we're speaking about the tea tree variety here, which we have mentioned is a factor in the overall tea caffeine content. So some of the varieties that are being used for white tea traditionally in Fujian are simply considered to be less caffeinated on the first place. As for the processing part, as I said, I'm not really sure how it influences the overall caffeine content in white tea. So what we know, however, maybe we should speak with some, chemists, which might shed some light on how exactly caffeine responds to heat treatment. What is known, however, is that caffeine is highly soluble in hot water. So again, this is also a factor about how caffeinated is the tea that we drink and what is our personal caffeine intake. And this is a factor that for sure greatly influences the overall caffeine amount in our tea soup. This will be the time that we take to infuse, to brew our tea. So the more, like simply said, the more we steep the tea, the more we brew the tea, the longer we brew it, the more caffeinated our tea soup will be, regardless of whether we are brewing green, say white, or whatever kind of tea we are.
So we can assume that if we brew tea, let's say Western method, the longer we brew it, the more caffeinated it will be.
One good thing about the Gong Fu kind of tea brewing is that it distributes the caffeine intake more evenly, because well, when we drink Gong Fu style, it is rarely something that we do in terms of like 5 or 10 minutes, which will roughly take us a Western brewing style. So we don't consume all the caffeine just at once, but we take it in small doses, which are separated in time. Because in the same time we talk, or we might meditate, we might read a book, we might do something else. So yeah, it is. It seems it's like more. Yeah, it just takes longer for this overall caffeine to reach our system and to act on it.
Many people think that Pu-erh is the most caffeinated type of tea, that this is like coffee or even stronger than coffee. And so let's talk about Pu-erh. And of course, there are two different kinds of Pu-erh. There is raw Pu-erh and there is ripe Pu-erh. So what are the differences between the two kinds, and which one is more caffeinated than other, if we can once again assume that or talk about one type being more caffeinated just based on the type of tea?
Indeed, so Pu-erh is like a major subject itself in the world of tea. So from the caffeine content side, if we look into this matter, so Pu-erh, as it usually it uses Yunnan large leaf variety, which is perceived as being more caffeinated than other varieties. So we need to start from there. So naturally, Pu-erh has this image of a very strong, very potent tea with a high caffeine content, very intense taste, very strong energy. So we are speaking here notably about Sheng Pu-erh, because we also have another variety, which is the ripe Pu-erh. It is produced by the same tea tree, of course, but its processing is different, and its impact on the human body is also very different from that of Sheng Pu-erh. So, and here is one very interesting thing here. When in the Western world, when people say Pu-erh, there is this idea, of a very strong, very potent kind of tea with a high caffeine content. However, when we speak about ripe Pu-erh, things do not seem like this. And here is an interesting fact. In fact, ripe Pu-erh, cooked Pu-erh, is the only kind of tea that the Chinese traditional medicine recommends as a suitable tea to drink late in the evening or even before falling asleep. So there is Hong Cha as well, that is considered more or less suitable to drink in the later hours of the day. But cooked Pu-erh is a definite recommendation as the only kind of tea that is suitable to drink late in the evening or even before falling asleep. So knowing how different its Sheng counterpart is, we might ask ourselves why it is so and how is that possible at all. Well, there are actually a couple of theories as to why it is so. So according to one theory, the internal transformation that caffeine undergoes during the fermentation phase prevents it somehow from binding to our nervous system, and therefore it doesn't affect sleep. There is also another, idea that suggests that the caffeine that exists in free form in the tea leaves binds to other substances during the cooling phase, that is after the fermentation. So when we drink this finished cooked Pu-erh tea, there is less free form caffeine. There is less caffeine that is in its free form, and therefore less caffeine that is able to bind, to our nervous system, and less caffeine that can be like freely and quickly released in our bodies. So most of it has already become compounded with something else. And so it has a more subtle, more gentle effect on our body. Again, I am neither a Chinese traditional medicine practitioner nor a chemist to be able to say to what extent this is true. However, judging by my personal experience, because, I love tea and I am very sensitive to caffeine. So whenever I drink tea after 6 p.m., this for me means a long and sleepless night. However, drinking ripe Pu-erh later in the day or even in the evening definitely does not affect my sleep the way that other tea types do. So I guess that everyone can judge by example, or given the theories that we quoted, in the research. Still, everyone has to make their own, research and experience, mostly, to see how this affects their system, their body. For me, this works, especially regarding ripe Pu-erh. So I can definitely say that for me, these theories hold some truth.
All right, so now that we confused people enough, gave a bit of contradictory information, we should leave, our viewers to process it and to experiment for themselves and see which teas, affect them more than other teas, because as we came to a conclusion, in many aspects, it's a very personal reaction to certain elements that tea contain. So the conclusion that we can make that it is very hard to determine which teas are more caffeinated than other teas, just based on the type of tea itself, because it depends on so many factors that you have to take into account, that it is very hard to tell just by the name of the tea or by the type of the tea. So you have to, and the best way is just
lots of things into account.
Yes.
And not forget your personal response to this or that tea, because your body is a unique system, and it is important, to be able to read its signals.
Indeed. So cheers to everyone who's drinking tea. I hope you won't get too overly caffeinated. And see you next time. Cheers.